Over the last few lessons, we've been talking about a number of reforms that took place under Charles I, including this period of personal rule that we've been talking about from around 1629 to 1640. Well, in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about opposition to the sort of personal rule era and the further tensions and conflicts that began to take place with Parliament before we ultimately get the outbreak of the English Civil War and the Revolution in a couple of lessons' time. So specifically, we looked at this period of personal rule, and we also looked at the specific religious reforms that were made during this period. So this period was a period of financial reforms as well as religious reforms, and also a number of changes that were made to foreign policy, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And effectively what we're going to do here is talk about how Parliament began to oppose this period of personal rule and how this increased tensions further between Charles I and his parliaments. So we're going to look at the concept of Charles's financial reforms, we're going to look at the opposition to the financial reforms, and then we'll look at some of the consequences that stemmed from this opposition. So when it comes to financial reforms, we've been talking in the past few lessons, effectively since the start of this series of lessons, on one of the key aims that the monarch has when it comes to calling their parliament during this period, and that is the raising of revenue, the financial aspect of parliament. And there's always a back and forth that seems to take place between the various monarchs and parliaments when it comes to the raising of revenue. This happened under James I, and it's also happened under Charles I. And it should be noted that Parliament was very hesitant to provide Charles with any kind of additional funding at this point during this period of personal rule. And so what Charles had to do was, instead of having to go to Parliament to request any kind of funding, additional finances, he had to rely on other methods to raise revenue. And with the help of the Attorney General, William Noy, he made a number of different reforms to increase his revenue and to increase the amount of money he had available to him. First of all, he saved around $500,000 per annum by ending the conflict with Spain, and this was done in 1630 with the Treaty of Madrid. As we already know, war is very, very costly, it's very, very expensive, and so one of the quickest ways of being able to save more money and to have more disposable income available to him, Charles simply decided to end the conflicts with Spain and saved up to $500,000 per annum. The next thing he did was the utilisation of the taxation we call tonnage and poundage, and this raised up to £358,000. Again, at the time, this was a substantial sum. Charles also began to issue monopolies in return for a particular fee. This was a practice that had begun, or at least was popularised under James I, and was restricted slightly under James and Charles, but then Charles had decided to issue more monopolies, and in return for issuing monopolies for certain industries, for certain companies, they would pay Charles a handsome fee and therefore raise revenue that way. And then finally we have the concept of the tax on ship money, which is something we're going to talk about in a second. So when we're talking about the concept of ship money, this was a tax that was levied on coastal countries to pay for the navy. And while this was something that most monarchs did, including Charles, where Charles was different was that he issued it as an annual tax and charged it against all countries. So this method actually was very useful because it managed to raise Charles around $200,000 per annum per year between the years 1634 to 1640. So a substantial sum was raised over this period through this method. Now, when it comes to opposition to financial reforms, we can note several examples where we can see opposition take place. So, for example, in 1629, the merchant, Richard Chambers, refused to pay the taxation of tonnage and poundage, since he argued that it disproportionately impacted those working in trade, like him. And as a result of this disdain towards, the distraint of knighthood, so this was an ancient levy that was based on an act from 1278. We see an uprising that was attempted by Sir David Foulis. So we can see here we have two different examples of financial opposition to financial reforms. We have the refusal to pay tonnage and poundage by merchant Richard Chambers in 1629 because it was disproportionate according to him. And we also see an ancient levy based on an Act of Parliament from 1278 leading to the attempted uprising by Sir David Foulis. And this uprising was in 1634. So we can see that we have opposition to multiple different areas of financial reforms and financial policy that Charles had enacted. And we can see that this had led to an uprising in 1634. Moreover, we could talk about John Hampden, who was a Puritan who challenged the levy on ship money, which was something we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. And he did this in 1636, and he sought to challenge it within the court system, using the judiciary as a method by which to challenge this financial reform by Charles. And while the courts did rule in favour of Charles in 1637, so ultimately against John Hampden, it did nevertheless show that there was a considerable disdain for the ship money levy that had existed under Charles. So even though the courts ruled in favour of Charles, and Charles ultimately won that particular case, it did still show that the general populace was ultimately against the concept of the ship money levy. Finally, we have the opposition. We have evidence of opposition, if you will, through the taxpayers' strike. Now, this was in 1639, and it was a refusal to pay the tax on the ship money. So, again, just like the court case that we've just looked at, was a very good indicator of the kind of disdain that people had for this particular levy. So was the 1639 taxpayers' strike. And it was partly because of this strike that Charles decided to recall Parliament in 1640. And ultimately, we have the recalling of Parliament in 1640, and ultimately further tensions began to increase. Now, in the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about relationships between the other areas of the realm, if you will, so Scotland and Ireland, for example, and then we're going to talk about the short and long parliaments. That then we will be diving into the outbreak and ultimately the series of events that took place during the English Civil War.